New paths for global interaction, and we have two different approaches. The institutional approach from Gianmichele, if I understand well, and the data-driven approach from Daniel and Gabby.
So, hello everybody. I have a presentation here, which I'll try to follow to some extent. But I have to say that I've been listening to the interventions from this morning, and I find them so inspiring, so full of ideas that, you know, I will start by begging your pardon for me to move in different directions. But let me start again from thanking Susanna. Susanna and the university. The feeling that I have here today, and I was talking with one of Susanna's excellent collaborators, Claudia Morini, earlier, is that I'm sharing a vision. You know, sometimes it's precisely at difficult times that you need to sort of feed, nurture thinking and ideas and sort of strengthen your efforts even further. And 2 words about me. I've been working for the UN since quite a long time, but not only in 3 different UN agencies. The work that I'm doing for CFS is the 3rd of the agencies or UN endeavors that I've been involved with, but also coming from the NGO. I've also worked for the private sector, and I would say that all of this is pretty fitting with what happens within the CFS. A few points on what I've heard today. First of all, the CFS, Committee on World Food Security. What is food security? In the minds of those that are not involved in their daily tasks, food security has to do with food safety mainly. Is it what I'm eating something that is of quality or not? But let me give you the definition. We have food security when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences to lead an active and healthy life. So it has, yes, there may be a little portion of that has to do with food safety and quality, but it's much more. It's having what we need to lead a normal, dynamic, active life, which again brings us back pretty much to the issue of democracy. Susanna was saying it's an institutional attempt, and there was an intervention just a few minutes ago concerning that. Yes, it is. This is a time when not only civil society, but much more than that, governments, and I'll tell you more about it, got together and actually tried to put together a platform that addresses, or at least attempts to address, some of the root causes of global food insecurity and malnutrition. What did I hear today? Because I really wanted to stress some of the points that I've heard. We need to work together. This is a mantra that is always there, and no, we need to work together, do it together. But I heard something different. We have to do it at different levels. There are problems which cannot be solved by single governments or by single nations. So it's just the scope of the issues that we have at hand that obliges us, the complexity of those issues that obliges us to really work in a different manner. We need an integrated approach. Working on one particular sector is not enough. And actually, one of the things that we've learned in the work in the Committee on World Food Security is that we need a systems approach, one that allows us, for each and every intervention we bring forward, to understand the consequences, both intended and unintended, on all sorts of other sectors that at the beginning of our project, when imagining our objectives, may or may not at all be in our minds. And this brings to the other point, and the raison d'être of the CFS, which is the need for greater policy coherence and greater policy convergence. If we are to address certain problems of a global nature, we need to have, as much as possible, a common vision of what those problems are, as well as what the solutions, what the tools are for all of us at all levels, all actors, to address those problems. Again, on the CFS, and I should have done this, but on the CFS, one last point. The CFS is an institutional endeavor, but what is really interesting about it is that there is no sector of society that is not, in one way or another, and you may choose your entry point, represented in CFS. And I'll tell you more about it. But this brings me back to the issue of who owns CFS. And actually, I would claim that this is a quite diffuse ownership, with some governments, in the case of CFS, that may be more equal than others, but indeed, everybody sits, everybody has a place around the table. So, what is CFS? And this is a definition that is part of UN language, and sorry for its being quite bureaucratic, the foremost inclusive, international, and intergovernmental platform for all stakeholders, food security, nutrition. This is really what it's all about, inclusivity, or inclusiveness. It was reformed in 2009, and let me tell you why it was reformed in 2009. Its foundation go back to the 70s, but it was reformed in 2009 because, as some of you may remember, in 2007 and 2008, there was a huge food crisis with huge spikes in terms of prices of food, which brought the vulnerability, the food insecurity at levels that had been unprecedented. At that time, the political will to address such huge problems reached a point that, all governments, and you may remember some of you, L'Aquila, the G8 summit at L'Aquila, organized by the Italian government, which had addressed some food security issues. But even before that, all governments tried to imagine a solution to the huge problems that they were witnessing at that particular time. And part of that solution is precisely the CFS, or the CFS is meant to be part of that solution. And its main feature, and again I go to the word inclusive and inclusiveness, is that it's a huge variety of stakeholders that are represented in CFS. Let me just mention them, and I'll read them just not to forget any of them. UN agencies. Most of the UN agencies somehow directly or indirectly involved in food security and nutrition. Actually, all of them are represented in CFS. Civil society and non-governmental organizations, and you know, Mira, all about that, representing smallholder, family farmers, fisher folks, herders, landless, urban poor. They've all come together to create a mechanism and a network that feeds into the work of CFS. And it's not uncommon for me to be talking around the table with the fisher folk from Indonesia, and some other times with a smallholder farmer, with a farmer from Zimbabwe. International Agricultural Research Institution, which I think it's important to stress while talking within a university. International and regional financial institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on, and as well as private sector associations, which goes back to some of my earlier questions as to where does the private sector actually fit within all of this. Well, it has a place in the vision of CFS. The other point that I'd like to stress, which actually, talks a little bit about due diligence as well, because at the time, in 2008, when the governments were asking themselves, what do we really need to address these problems? The issue of the independence of evidence and scientific basis for the decisions to be taken came about. So a high-level panel of experts was established and still exists and still is operating. So every year there's a call for voluntary contribution and voluntary participation in this high-level panel of experts, which is the body to which, whenever the CFS has a question, we go to receive an objective, independent, scientific answer. Now, is this perfectly objective? Is this perfectly independent? It is as independent and as objective as we could ever hope for. And then, you know, this is something that links me to UNHRD and to other great endeavors that actually are taking place in Italian soil. The 3 Rome-based agencies that have an agricultural and food vocations are all represented and all contribute with their technical knowledge and their experience, their lessons to the debate and the dialogue between the various stakeholders in CFS. How do we do this? I'll just skim through very quickly. It's a matter of really bringing the information, the evidence, all to the table and trying to address some of these issues. All of this ends, and this is important to say, with a political negotiation. The final decision is in the hands of governments through a political negotiation. So everything, all of this is brought to the table, and it sort of channels the discussion towards a solution. But ultimately, we cannot, as an intergovernmental body, exclude politics from the discussion. And some of you may see this very negatively, others very positively. But the truth is that you need, in many ways, you need governments to be at the table and to own the decisions that ultimately they have part of the responsibility to implement. Let me just stress one last point. I mean, from all of this, it may seem that we have found the solution to all sorts of huge and complex issues. Not at all. There are problems. There are difficulties. And we're discussing right now how to even further strengthen the CFS and to make it more pointed, more sharp, more evidence-based. And as we speak, on the basis of the results of an evaluation, all of this discussion is taking place. I'll be very quick just to run you through how does all of this happen. So this high-level panel of experts comes up with a report that basically gives the status of science on that particular issue. It does not research, it does not carry out independent research. It independently brings together in a format that is understandable and digestible for a political forum all scientific evidence on a particular topic. And then all of this is transformed through a political negotiation into some that are the final products of the CFS. And we're talking about voluntary guidelines, principles that are meant to be used by governments, but as well as all other stakeholders, civil society as well, to address some of the root causes of food insecurity. One example, 2012 voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of land, fisheries, and forest. We all know how crucial stable and fair access to land is for people's food security. Very difficult topic, but one that CFS at the time was able to look into and to at least attempt to find some solutions for. What are we doing right now? Well, actually, we realized that there was another huge global problem that many of us actually talk about, but that needed, again, looking at that interconnectedness between sectors, needed CFS in particular to work on it, and that is nutrition. Just very quickly, I just jotted down some of the main numbers. 155 million children under 5 stunted. Stunted means also not only physically but mentally impaired. So people that will never reach as adult their full potential. 50 million children are wasted. 50 million, it's huge. 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. Again, huge problems in terms of their own development, the development of their own children, the next generations. 2 billion are overweight and obese. And this is something that we never think of. But overweight and obesity is now the number one cause, or the number one risk for those non-communicable diseases that represent the major cause of morbidity and mortality around the world. This again, nutrition, food, agriculture, this is what we're trying to address nowadays. And we're trying to do that, and again, these two pictures are meant to describe, one, the science. That is a report that is available that you can download as an example of the work of the high-level panel of experts. But next to it is, what are we looking at? When we want to address the issue of nutrition, is it just a health issue? Well, no. If you look at that donut, you have production. How do you produce food? You have storage and distribution. You have processing, packaging. And again, the role of the private sector, companies and so on, is huge. How can you address all of this without them, in one way or another, involved in the process? Retail and markets, availability and physical access of the food. You may have heard about food deserts, places where the only food available is basically convenience food. I mean, it's comfort food, or the economic access of food, of healthy and nutritious food. Do people have the income that allows them to access that food? Promotion, advertising, information. We've talked about this this morning quite a bit. How are we informing the people, and how do citizens react to that information? Because ultimately, it's a matter of individual choices, which, by the way, our experience shows are not easy to change. I will stop here. I really look forward to hearing back from you. But again, if there's one point that I want to stress again, it's really the ability that everybody here in this room has to somehow influence the dialogue and the thoughts and thinking through your own constituencies that is taking place in the CFS. Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Daniel Goldman and Gabriella Capone.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to thank Susanna and Saverio for putting together what's already been an extraordinary event. I first met Susanna at a conference in DC a number of years ago as part of a committee that advises the multilateral institutions, and both of us have a constructivist view of those institutions. Perhaps that's why we're on the committee. And as soon as I met Susanna, I asked her what she's interested in. And she said, I'm working on applying Kant's theories of perpetual peace to achieving universal democracy. And immediately I knew that we were going to be very close friends for a long time. And I'm thrilled to see this vision start to come to fruition and look forward to hearing everyone's contributions and to your feedback on our ideas on this work.
And hello, I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Gabrielle Capone, colleagues with Daniel Goldman, and I'm coming here from Yale University and the Governance Lab at New York University. Thank you for having us.
So in the 19th century at Cambridge, politics and economics were taught together as part of the moral sciences curriculum. And it would be unusual for somebody today to think of either of those disciplines together in the first place, let alone as inherently moral doctrines. And I think that a key part of supranational democracy should be to restore those disciplines to their rightful place as mechanisms to understand the human condition and how to improve it for all of humankind, rather than as a mechanism to promote self-interest, which are the directions to which the field has been taken by certain individuals. And so we're going to start by talking about some problems, most of which won't be particularly news to us, but as a means to frame the discussion. And then we're going to talk about some innovations and prospective solutions to some of these challenges. And so the refugee crisis, which of course only became a crisis in the international dialogue once it directly impacted Europeans and Americans, is testament to the extent to which many of our trusted institutions and governance mechanisms have been inadequate against modern challenges. And these are pictures of the Rohingya fleeing Rakhine State in Bangladesh and the Syrians. And they're part of the broader framework of political instability, and that in recent years and months we've seen the rise of nuclear tensions, the ascent of the far right and the far left at once. And to those who contend that the far left is a positive check on the far right, I would answer that they're actually fueling one another in creating a negative feedback mechanism whereby the rise of the far left is becoming a rallying cry for the far right and vice versa, such that it's promoting even greater polarization. And last time this happened, it certainly did not end well. Along with these other phenomena that we're all familiar with, so rising isolationism, particularly amongst OECD countries, protectionism and the prospect of trade wars, the rise of nativism, several failed states, such as Venezuela, or near failed states, Zimbabwe. There are those who were optimistic about Mnangagwa, but his prior status as head of Mugabe's intelligence services suggests to me that we would best temper our expectations as to the actual reforms that he's likely to implement. We've seen election interference and disputed elections in the US as well as Kenya, and unchecked aggression by a variety of parties internationally, including Putin in Crimea, in the US, in all too many countries. And this has been accompanied by financial and economic fragility as well. So from surface metrics, it may appear that the economy is in recovery, but to a great extent, this recovery has been artificial. So we have the accumulation of sovereign debt globally to unprecedented levels, and this leaves very low fiscal space, so that if there is another downturn, there will be little opportunity to use fiscal policy to remedy these conditions. There are negative yields on many instruments due to artificial techniques used by central banks, such as quantitative easing and what is charitably called unconventional monetary policy to prop up assets. This has fostered an equity bubble. If you look to the left, this is a chart from the economist Robert Shiller, showing cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratios. This is for the US, and the only two times since this metric started being tracked and back-tested back to the 1880s that it's been as high as today were 1929, immediately before the Great Depression, and 2000, immediately before the tech crash. And these phenomena have not been confined to high-income countries, but in emerging markets, we've seen repeatedly the impacts of commodity shocks. This has been particularly the case in the Middle East, Latin America, and African economies, which have been quite troubled in pursuing fiscal policy due to high commodity price volatility and the excessive dependency of their economies on these. And these charts show that we have, until very recently, we've had the lowest interest rates in 5,000 years. The equity market rise is not exactly a natural one. It's because there are very few opportunities in the investment grade fixed income market. And sovereign debt, this is a chart of $63 trillion. And Rogoff and Reinhardt's seminal work in this time is different, track the extent to which once sovereign nations cross first the 60% threshold and then the 90% threshold of sovereign debt to GDP. And granted, that's a stock to flow metric, but it's still the most reliable one we have. That substantially increases the chances of various types of economic crises. So we are confronting a fragile economic system as well. And so what brought us here, and these are photos of the General Assembly and then another photo of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1994 and 1944 rather. And as Susanna alluded to this morning, at the times that the multilateral architecture was established, these institutions were at once revolutionary, highly innovative, and necessary. But the time has come, and it's part of why we're all here, to rethink aspects of that governance. In the aftermath of two horrific world wars that were primarily interstate conflicts, the need was acute on the political side to ensure or to dramatically reduce the risks of interstate conflicts. And that has been certainly not fully effective, but the incidence of interstate violence has reduced somewhat since then. Nevertheless, as we heard from our proposed SDG 18 on democracy, the UN system contains members of varying levels of democracy, unfortunately including my home country now. And with the decline of the Bretton Woods system, with leaving the gold standard in the 1970s, the international monetary system is not on firm footing. And so the rise of cryptocurrency can be attributed to many factors, but part of it is a testament to the weakness in government-backed currencies, for which they've had a monopoly in most countries since the 18th century, and they've done less than ideal job in maintaining that monopoly, given the extent to which currencies which are inherently volatile and problematic are now becoming desired and prominent. It certainly says something about the currencies that we've come to know from governments. The decolonization process led a lot of nations into the international architecture, and that process was not necessarily handled well, in that the OECD countries retained very high levels of voting rights, and the larger and more powerful nations retained veto measures at the Security Council, and this has led to the rise of Chinese institutions such as the AIIB, which have gained extraordinary prominence in just a couple of years, and this again poses a challenge to the historical multilateral system, as well as the various China, Latin America, and China-Africa partnerships. And the lack of participation mechanisms in the formal voting bodies affiliated with the multilateral institutions have created fractures in the governance and economic architecture. And while there's been significant successes in control, well, not full certainly, but significant successes in controlling interstate violence, intrastate violence has continued almost unabated, and we see horrific incidences in the DRC, almost 5 million, or roughly 5 million dead in the Second Congo War recently. Bosnia-Herzegovina, the tragic conflict in Syria is ongoing and has contributed to the rise of terrorist non-state actor ISIS. The Rwanda conflict, for which the West certainly has blood on its hands, as well as the multilateral institutions. The Cambodia genocide, and members of the Khmer Rouge are still in power, and the ICC has been relatively inert against the perpetrators of these, and so this is another direct challenge to the political governance systems that exist. And there's been a lack of public oversight. So talked about state supremacy in the international architecture, but this is a widespread problem within the economy as well. So the rise of ETFs and passive investing, as well as the growth of institutional investors and sovereign funds that are managing hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars, and that effectively rubber stamp executive decisions by large corporations. Not certainly many of them are good actors, but there are also many that are not, and there's limited accountability for controlling them. The rise of the regulatory administrative state, which we're familiar with, and the trends of decline of democracy.
Furthermore, so obviously we're going to be talking about the power of technology and the impact that we believe it can have for participatory and decentralized governance. But there is the giant issue right now, which we heard about earlier with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal revolving around the unfulfilled promise of Western technology. As it stands, technology is a privately regulated entity, not only in the US, but around the world, though much of that is stemming from decisions that are simply made without any sort of government oversight in Silicon Valley. And if anyone watched the congressional hearing with Mark Zuckerberg, the level of political understanding and education around technology issues is also particularly acute in this space. So when we talked about training political actors and politicians to be able to understand issues, this one I think would be high on the list. Additionally, we'll talk a little bit about the psychopathic and psychological tendencies for people to want to go into their separate camps, and we're actually finding the technology, rather than connecting and increasing communication and conversation between groups, is actually exacerbating the conversations through filter bubble mechanisms and mechanisms that are meant to really drive profits rather than foster a sort of public fora space of conversation for users.
And much of this actually can be attributed to the distortion of or the appropriation of much of traditional economic and political thinking, although in many cases actually it's representative. There's a great quote by Keynes to the extent that practical men often imagine themselves free from the influence of political and economic theory, but in fact all of us are largely beholden to the ideas of long-dead economists and political theorists. And the valorization of self-interest at every level, the quotation of Smith out of context, even though in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and throughout The Wealth of Nations he problematizes this idea, the notion that self-interest is supposed to be the principal mechanism by which decisions are to be made by individuals and firms. Sharpe, one of the architects of modern financial and portfolio theory, that risk-adjusted financial returns are supposed to be the principal criteria for decisions by investors and by the financial arms of firms. Kuznets, the father of GDP, and even though he himself did not necessarily espouse that this was supposed to be the be-all and end-all metric for decision-making by states, it's been taken to justify economic growth, despite problems with GDP metrics, which Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi have chronicled very effectively in the work Mismeasuring Our Lives, to justify economic growth as measured by GDP above all else. And then Richelieu, since we're in Italy, I left out Machiavelli from this, but as one of the principal architects of realpolitik, which has been carried through the centuries, the notion that states are supposed to act in their own perceived self-interest rather than the interests of humankind. And so this has contributed to polarization. If it's every actor for him or herself, metaphorically speaking, and social, communal, environmental benefits are to be relegated to externalities, that's going to create long-term cracks in the international structures.
Fantastic. And because, I mean, all of the issues that impact and that need to inform decision-making from the supranational kind of theoretical level and as well as in practice, all incredibly complex. So we think it's really important to kind of lay out what we find to be really significant trends, factors, influences that are kind of creating the environment that we're in. So hopefully that's helped to kind of characterize the way we're seeing both this crisis in governance and some of the potential causes, but certainly not all of them. Now we're going to move forward into some of the consequences that we think are particularly dire as a result of this situation.
Sure, and so the alienation of the populace, where familiar with the unfulfilled promise of the Arab Spring, which itself was caused by failure of the status model of development, and Malik and Awadal at Oxford did excellent work on this in showing that the state's attempt within the Middle Eastern countries to maintain extensive control over political and economic as well as financial decision making, and reluctance to let the private sector or the social sector develop robustly, as well as the demographic shifts amongst Arab youth, contributed to the revolutions, and the fact that the institutions were weak to begin with created problems as well. So we see here again an instance of where an impulse towards promoting rigidity leads to greater fragility. Disputed elections and the rise of extremist groups, we've discussed this as well. Failed secession movements, Catalonia, Iraq, this has been mentioned this morning, and the acute refugee crises.
Further, in terms of looking at how actual administrative governance policy decisions are made, we see increasing militarization and securitization of decisions, as well as this move towards and bloat in the administrative state. Both of these trends really signal an excuse to exclude the popular public from actual decision-making processes, whether through the guise of executive power and delegating that out to agencies, which is a really acute issue in our own country, or if it's for security premises in which, citizenry should not be able to engage in security decisions. Let's funnel the budget to that. I'm not making that causal association, but that is essentially the relationship that's happening.
I've often said that if the US government had $600 billion devoted to a Department of Entrepreneurship and $1 billion devoted to so-called defense rather than the reverse, we might be living in a different world, but so it goes. And this is a quote from Yeats. There was a study that this is one of the most downloaded poems since 2016, but he was characterizing the increasing polarization in Europe in the aftermath, in the lead up to World War I. And just wanted to reassure you that none of these individuals, to my knowledge, are going to be participating in this conference, but.
Perfect. And then, so here we go. We made it. So now we're going to, attempt a little bit with some solutions. Obviously, there's no panacea. There is no perfect solution. We're going to review what are some of the commonly cited solutions to many of the causal issues that we just discussed. These are the ones that we often encounter. We're going to counter with our own solutions in just a second, but let's review some of these.
Sure, and so some of the, not all good news yet, don't worry. So we discussed revolutions, and these have had mixed results, although Tunisia, by all accounts, has been highly effective, but the rest of the Arab Spring movements have been mixed at best. Universal basic income is an interesting approach, and it points to the lack of mechanism for bottom-up economic design, but it's in many cases where there's an inadequate mechanism to transfer capital to the poor. Doing it directly has shown some promising results. The pseudo-benevolent dictator model of Singapore for many years, and more recently Ethiopia. One could question the extent to which there's a trade-off between economic growth and development, but some people postulate that. And then autocracy, I think it's pretty clear where we stand on that one.
And echoing some of the points that we made earlier, some people might argue that increasing bureaucracy could actually help to make decision-making more efficient or to make sure that it's more holistic, but really this might just entrench decision-making structures and power structures within organizations when they really should instead be reformed. We talked on the promise of technology, which, don't worry, we're actually proponents of. And then generally one might point to hyper-globalization or hyper-localization as similarly kind of these panacea solutions to really hard to put your finger on economic phenomena.
And so this is a wonderful anecdote that Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, was relaying at a conference recently about how about 25 years ago there was a proposal to finance telephone poles in India. And the bank examined this proposal, and fortunately somebody stepped in and said, hey, there's this thing called mobile phones, and maybe someday it'll get to India, and then we won't need all these telephone poles, and maybe we should prioritize other other things in development. And fortunately, the World Bank heeded this vision, although I don't think even the advisor envisioned the role that mobile phones would play. And so as we think about these solutions, we should say, what are the telephone poles in India of 2018, and how can we think through new solutions?
Okay, Susanna, now you can smile. So we're really excited to present from a lot of our field work, from our own work, from colleagues, a few of the innovations that we find particularly promising from the supranational governance standpoint, and really from the perspective of the design and governance of economic systems in particular. We find these solutions fit into what we deem an ecosystems approach, and as our colleague mentioned earlier, this idea of systems-based decision-making is really one in which every member of the system actually has a say or has an import by nature of a system being the set of interconnected agents. So much in the same way that if you look at the different layers of the Amazon jungle and can't prioritize a layer because every layer has an impact on every other one, that's really one of the major principles that's guiding how we evaluate innovations and think that they could really have impact for supranational democratic governance. And we deem this distributed participatory platforms for bottom-up rather than top-down and data-driven economic design and governance. So part of the school of innovation that we're talking about here is really this idea of distributed systems and bringing the idea of scientific and empirical decision-making out of the sciences into policymaking and into governance. And there are a lot of technologies that have kind of in our own lives enabled us to experience the power of distributed systems and systems decision-making every day now in the past 10 to 15 years. These include everything from mobile phone proliferation and penetration across the world to the idea of crowdfunding and alternative forms of financing, as we saw just a few minutes ago.
Sure, and what's quite interesting about a lot of these innovations is that many of them are coming out of Africa and South Asia and other low-income countries because they're not competing with legacy infrastructure, and so they're growing far more rapidly. And so telemedicine is an instance of a great innovation where, in lieu of building hospitals in remote areas, which is extremely expensive and capital inefficient, individuals can get world-class health advice through mobile devices. Flipped Classroom University, there's a university called Kepler in Rwanda, which is aggregating the best digital lectures globally for people to watch in the evening, and then they're participating in seminars together during the day. And so you'll see the inversion of models and technology-enabled models for distributed systems that are growing far faster in low-income countries.
And particular power in these forms of technologies is that they are participatory and they are ground up and they are built on a distributive model where it's not a matter of top-down settings or information provision, but it's actually ground up. And in a similar vein, we see these kinds of innovations in governance and specifically in crowdsourcing in the public sector, which is my personal area of focus. And this can range everything from participatory and collective ways to create rules together, whether it be a law or a constitution, as we can ask one of our colleagues here at the conference. But it can also be about creating more efficient and transparent mechanisms in order to deliver justice, as we see in the Gacaca courts in Rwanda. Furthermore, this actually can really be enabled by a digitized government that itself is adopting and very tech-friendly and very it's self-educated in and promoting. So you congratulate Susanna on her Estonian e-citizenship, which is just a perfect example of a government experimenting with the powers of technology. And to get into some of these specifically, we have the Mi Senado, My Senate app, which is coming out of Colombia. This is an app created and deployed by the Colombian Senate in order to increase accountability, transparency, and citizen participation in plenary sessions. It takes place in real time. In real time, a citizen can see who is actually present at the plenary session, a form of accountability. You can't really provide your impact or your voice to a senator that's not there. Additionally, you can see real-time voting that's happening by the senators, in addition to actually providing feedback on the bill that's at play. So this is just a very simple, elegant solution that can be implemented by a legislator. Furthermore, in France, we have Parlement Citoyen, through which legislators and representatives can run consultations with citizens and define a problem that citizens can help them to identify the causal issues and sources of. And similarly, citizens can collaborate on, one, defining solutions to the problem and actually drafting legislative text that then the representative can take to their body. And this is another homegrown example, but really integral to making these kinds of participatory and crowdsourced governance models work is the right to participation being institutionalized and having an institutionalized pipeline from the citizen who's participating to the government. And actually the regions of Bologna, or the city of Bologna and the region of Tuscany have actually been leaders in this.
And there have been very interesting innovations in data collection and analysis. So Premise is a company that makes micropayments to people in low-income countries to take photos of economic activity at scale and then uses image processing technology to aggregate that to get data on their economy. And this creates jobs for people in low-income countries and also creates more accurate statistics than the government is able to provide. Ushahidi is a crisis response company in Africa that was started in the aftermath of election violence that enables citizens to track natural disasters or security events, similar to the Palestinian tech startup Red Crow. And this is being used concurrently by citizens, NGOs, policymakers to gain a better understanding of conditions on the ground in these countries. And so, whereas in the US you often see brilliant technology used for frivolous ends, and this is true in Europe as well, in many low-income countries, you see it actually being used to solve real material policy challenges in a crowdsourced, bottom-up, participatory way that's scaling very effectively and leveraging the fact that most people in low-income countries have mobile connectivity now.
Equally exciting is increasing the understanding of and really the power of the back end that's processing all of these inputs that you collect from citizens. So when you have all of this new data on totally new different topics, you're collecting it by text, you're collecting it by image, you're collecting it by voice, you need really sophisticated systems on the back end to make any sense of that. So when you hear artificial intelligence or machine learning, they're the ones who are actually trying to find a way to make sense of that, to deliver something that whether it's a citizen or a private institution can actually make use of. So the company that Daniel and I are affiliated really does just this and seeks to kind of create a common economic language so that you can take economic data from different industries and different contexts and make it usable to other industries and other contexts.
And data for development, and this is an example of an innovation coming out of multilateral institution, the UN, where there are data science labs in New York and Jakarta where massive amounts of traffic data, social media data, mass media data, economic data are aggregated from the public and then used to inform humanitarian and developmental decisions in real time. And this is a brilliant innovation. And so the justifications for the prospective solutions, theoretical, so they're the enlightenment and empowerment-based discourses, hearkening back to the traditions from the Scottish Enlightenment and broader European Enlightenment, and the rights-based justifications with which the UN certainly has enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but that date back to the same period. And direct democracy, a movement that took off briefly, roughly a century ago, and faded out in many contexts, but that technology now affords us the means to revive. And from a pragmatic perspective, affording people greater economic and political inclusion, whether through technology or community-based methods, fosters equity and inclusivity, and promotes accountability, as many of our speakers have addressed thus far, and ascribes greater and creates greater legitimacy for decision making. And we've seen many innovations already discussed in this conference that will help promote these objectives.
So in thinking, coming from our background where it's very much heavily built around getting very good quality data and being able to make empirically driven decisions based on that data, we can envision how these tools can really lead the next generation of multilateral institutions, particularly to the benefit of these supranational and democratic considerations. And what we're really outlining here is an approach that harnesses and plays around with and pilots new methods of participation that harnesses the collective intelligence of the citizenry, whether it be the public citizenry or the expert citizenry, and that really takes a bottom-up approach through the inclusion of those members in the system to really improve the planning, design, and governance of that system.
So for instance, we saw that stateless people were now permitted to participate under a separate flag at the Olympics, and we advocate that stateless people should now have a vote at the multilateral bodies. Similarly, in Germany, labor gets a seat on the board in many companies, and we advocate that the global citizenry should get a seat on the board of the IMF and the World Bank. And the way that these digital systems ought to grow should be consistent with the international agreements which have established norms regarding rights and goals around which there was broad international agreement, not just from states but from the global citizenry, and which were often created in a very participatory way, as we've heard earlier. And digital tools afford a new mechanism to track and drive progress towards those in such a way that not just governments and multilaterals ought to be accountable for driving us towards them, but the global populace should be as well.
And further, going back to our earlier point that really the technology is being governed from the private sector, we think there are so many opportunities and mechanisms for smart governance of technology through the public sector. And these include really good curation and management of content to respect privacy concerns, but to also foster public deliberation and deliberative democratic trends, as well as to create and identify the mechanisms that really help to promote participation. Right now, generally, public participation is a very apathetic endeavor because the input from the citizen does not properly get used by, if at all, by the government or public agencies receiving it. So figuring out the right reward mechanisms to rebuild that trust and to also make that data useful to the public institution is really critical.
And what we seek to do is move the locus of power from Davos to the global demos and facilitate a transition through the use of digital platforms to enable bottom-up approaches to promoting greater global equity and equality and fulfilling Kant's vision from many years ago of global empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you.